I'm Margot Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I have with me a great panel of folks who are really much steeped in the issues of multi-state or regional coordination and how that might work under 111D. You have their full bios in your folders, but I would first like to introduce John Brecky. He's the Vice President of Great River Energy. You will all know that as a co-op located in Minnesota. He will talk a bit about Great River, I'm sure, and about their particular interest in multi-state coordination. We then next have Secretary Colin O'Mara, who's with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. He's running a lot of the state's programs that deal with a whole range of environmental issues, and we'll have some perspectives from the RGGI experience as well. And finally, we have, and I'm going to blow it again, Paul Sitkiewicz. Say it again, Sitkiewicz.
Smith.
Thank you. Chief Economist at PJM Interconnection. He's thought long and hard about multi-state coordination for obvious reasons. They coordinate on a number of issues at PJM, and I think he's going to provide some perspective that will be helpful as we think through just what does this mean to have more than one state cooperating with each other in this particular 111D framework. We've heard throughout the day that states are already cooperating in any number of different ways, yet this is adding a different layer of complexity perhaps or of interest. So I think I really want to start it off with just asking each of the panelists that since they've explored the possibility of regional coordination, what are some of the benefits they could see if states do decide to work together either as a group of states or by a region, and then we can flow out of that with some of the challenges, and I hope that we're going to get into some of the details. Sometimes we float way up here about extolling the virtues of this stuff. I'd like to get into some of the nuts and bolts because I think it does get really interesting when you start talking about who shot John when. So, John, you want to, not literally, John.
Thank you.
So, if you could start off with a little bit about the benefits that from your perspective.
Thank you. We think there are a lot of benefits to states coordinating efforts on greenhouse gas reduction goals under 111D or under other measures that are driven by state policy. Our industry has a long history of working together across state lines to build markets, to build interconnections, to serve load from plants in one state, consumers in another. And building on that long history by working together on the most pressing issue that we now face, which is carbon regulation, it seems to us that we can leverage some of the work that's been done over the last century in building integrated electricity markets, and specifically ISO markets. And one of the benefits that we see is specialization and comparative advantage. That by working together across state lines, you can benefit from events in other states. You don't have to have the same resource mix in each state in order to do that, nor do you have to have the same level of CO2 emissions per megawatt hour of production if you coordinate efforts across state lines. And thinking about this even more broadly, by coordinating efforts not only within this country, but globally, we have 343 gigawatts of coal-fired power in the United States. The world is adding about that much every 5 years. And so we could shut down every coal plant in the United States tomorrow, and 5 years from now, we'll have the same level of CO2 emissions from power plants globally. And it doesn't matter where the CO2 comes from. So let's let the United States be part of the solution. We are a research and development engineer, pioneer for the world. And by promoting the right types of policies that encourage the continued use of coal and making it ever cleaner through development of new technologies, we can spread those technologies to the world and have a global impact. That's an example of how coordination broader than just a local effort or state effort can really benefit the world on this global issue.
Colin, you want to embellish?
Great. Well, it's great to be with everyone this afternoon. I am excited about the topic of this panel because I think the opportunities for regional cooperation are probably greater around this than any other type of environmental challenge. You've heard from a lot of regulators today, and I think that's great. But at the end of the day, the environmental agencies are going to have to actually put together the state plans. And one of the things you'll find very quickly is that as folks are thinking through the way to get to kind of prove out their best system of emission reduction, a lot of the skills that are necessary to compile such a plan aren't the traditional roles of our air divisions in our departments. Folks that are comprised of engineers and looking at different types of scientists aren't necessarily the same ones that have the ability to do the economic accounting around different types of compliance mechanisms to kind of come to a whole. Which is one of the things that we found in the RGGI region, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, kind of ranging from Maine all the way down to Delaware and Maryland, is that by working together, the shared experience that you get from learning the best practices of other states really has a kind of a force multiplier effect, if you will, where all of a sudden you don't just have the brain power of your own little state agency, but really across several states, including some obviously very progressive ones, including some that are a little more conservative, and kind of everything in between. And so the benefits from having this kind of regional approach, just from the shared learning, are absolutely huge. But there's also many other benefits that I would argue actually maybe even more important to the industry and also to the regulators. One is around predictability. And if you can actually, if we have a system in place that actually allows the rate to be translated into a mass-based cap, that then can be aggregated across several states. Your ability to meet that cap isn't dependent on every single facility in your state being able to meet every single piece of the plan. You might have a nuclear plant, for example, in, I don't know, hypothetically speaking, in Vermont or New York that has been proposed for shutdown, but you don't know exactly when it's going to be allowed to happen. If that doesn't happen and you're just in an individual state, that could blow up your entire plant very easily. You might not be able to meet your numbers. If you have that kind of risk shared across the entire region, it's a blip in our case, a 90 million short ton cap. And so those are the types of conversations you get from this kind of regional economy of scale. The other thing too is just on the administration side. It becomes a lot easier. We're sharing resources on things. In the case of RGGI, for those of you that aren't aware, it is a cap and trade program. Cap and trade is alive and well. It's working very well in the Northeast. We just updated the cap. We made it a true market where it actually has market forces. But the auctions are done collectively. The resources are allocated through a very centralized mechanism, then given to the states for their efficiency programs and other things. If each state tried to have their own program, the administrative overhead of such a program would be overwhelming. The needs and the complexity of putting together a program like that for any individual state, especially a small state like a Delaware or a New Hampshire or Vermont, would absolutely make it impossible to have that at an individual state level. Regionally, sharing the cost is cheaper for everybody. And so we like to argue that RGGI is very much a plug-and-play system that anyone could join, and we're really welcoming anyone else to join as a compliance mechanism because these systems are already built in place. By having a mass-based approach that can translate into a cap that can be regional, you can actually have these partnerships across state lines and make it much easier than trying to figure out how you're going to hire 5 more economists to put together your plan. You can actually be part of something bigger and leverage those resources across many, many states, which makes it a much better alternative than for everyone to go alone.
Yeah, I think from an RTO perspective, if you think about regional coordination, we're already doing regional coordination on a daily basis. If you think about what we call security constrained unit commitment, that is making sure that units are available a day ahead for real-time dispatch the next day. And then in our real-time dispatch across, at least in PJM, a region that encompasses all or parts of 13 states in the District of Columbia. We also have a resource adequacy construct that coordinates across that footprint. So not all the capacity resources need to be in a particular state. Some states may be short, some states may be long, but you can share that capacity. We have interconnected systems. In fact, there's benefits to interconnection through reserve sharing in the sense that we don't have to have all of our eggs in one basket or just try to meet everything alone. There are benefits to that coordination that we've realized as a power system. And then finally, from an RTO perspective, there's also the coordination in regional planning. Rather than trying to plan state by state, we can look at broader regional transmission projects that could satisfy reliability or market efficiency goals. So given that tradition that the RTOs come from, it makes sense to to think about at least regional compliance or regional measurement of emissions that piggybacks on that regional coordination that already exists today. Moreover, I think if you look at other environmental programs from an RTO perspective, in almost all of our RTOs, we can reflect the cost of environmental attributes in our energy market. So going back to the SO2 trading program under Title IV, the Ozone Transport Commission, the OTAG program, all of those costs could be reflected in energy market offers. To the extent that we just saw with the mercury and air toxic standards, at least in our capacity construct, we can reflect the cost of environmental retrofits. So we already have a ready-made mechanism that allows for environmental compliance within our market framework. And so just offering the idea of regional compliance makes sense to piggyback on the infrastructure that is already there. But I also want to make it clear, though, that in the ISO RTO white paper, that while we are talking about regional compliance, it's not mandatory. It's an opt-in issue. As we heard today, there may be some states that have states' rights. Although I could imagine, I'm trying to remember who won the Civil War again when it comes to states' rights. But states could choose to go their own way, and that's okay too. And we can handle that from a regional reliability perspective. But in any event, it's piggybacking on the infrastructure and the institutions that already exist, and being able to work then with the state public service commissions, with the air regulators, and so on, to go forward on that.
So a couple interesting thoughts I thought out of this. There was a lot of discussion about that we have the mechanisms in place to foster better cooperation. What is it that you need out of the rule to make sure that you can cooperate as fully as you think is optimal to do so? So you've got a layer on top of the fact that we can impede or we can encourage cooperation, but we talked a little bit about mass-based or race-based. And what is it that you're hoping EPA would do, or what would you advise EPA to do? Might be too late. Advise EPA to do in the draft rule that would put wind in your sails, so to speak, so that would make the regional cooperation, multi-state cooperation easier. Conversely, what would be the worst thing they could do to get in the way? So it's kind of a jump ball.
I would say that the best thing that EPA could offer us is the flexibility to enable regional solutions that achieve equivalent outcomes. And the equivalent outcome would be measured on a regional basis, not at the state level. So the state's emissions of CO2 could be far different from what would be required under a state-by-state implementation approach. But as long as the region achieves an equivalent outcome in terms of CO2 emissions to what would otherwise prevail from the 111D regulation, that's really what we're after, is total flexibility, that really all we're looking for is an equivalent amount of CO2 emissions. Then under various ideas of how to get there on a regional approach, we've got one idea which is related to carbon prices, carbon revenues, and how those flow back to load-serving entities in the ISO RTO to offset the cost impact of this. RGGI has another solution. Cap and trade has been talked about in other regions. So depending on what method you use, you can still get to that equivalent outcome. But all we need really from EPA is to enable that, and we feel that they will do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really starts with making sure we are talking beyond the fence line. Every indication is that we are, but there's still some folks that would argue the counterpoint. So starting beyond the fence line, ending up with a rate that can be translated to a mass-based budget number, so you could have a statewide budget, and then making sure it's very clear. You can aggregate that, and as you were saying, kind of make sure that you can kind of scale that aggregation across multiple states. So whether the reduction occurs in your state or an adjacent one, as long as it's part of that mass-based target, and it's within that budget. That it counts, and that's considered full compliance. And these are all things that we fully expect to happen as part of the guidance coming out next month.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what John said. I think John and I are actually speaking exactly the same language here, and it's about regional compliance measurement. So you have some states that may have higher CO2 emissions or an emissions rate, others with lower emissions rates, and is aggregating across that wider region. But I think when it comes, EPA can provide that, and it's something that the ISOs and RTOs have actually requested that EPA put in their guidance. But I think even beyond that, though, is providing some guidance to the states on how they can make that happen. And I think I understood this morning from Gina McCarthy's comments that there is going to be that kind of guidance that's going to be issued. I have no idea what that looks like, but I think from a state perspective, it's going to help to have the guidance as to what it means to do regional compliance rather than kind of shooting in the dark here.
I don't know, it just seems to me like there's so many more variables. If you've got 8 states that are trying to work together, that you've got different goals in different states, although they're all going to be based on GHG goals. You've got all these different players. You've got all these different desires and different kinds of industry and resources. It seems to me that it really complicates the problem. So maybe what might be helpful is just a little lessons learned from RGGI about starting from scratch and how that kind of worked. And kind of a coda to that is also just the whole time scale, because it took a while to get RGGI mounted up and going. And the time scale that we're talking about in 111D, as many people have said today, seems like a holy cow moment of there's not enough time. We need that to be fairly flexible. It's another degree of flexibility that folks are asking for. So that's kind of a two-pronged question.
Sure. And
you can answer it or not.
Just in terms of the history of RGGI, I mean, the conversation started in 2005. It did take over 3 years to stand it up. You had 10 states originally involved. And you had, ranging from Republicans like Governor Ehrlich in Maryland and Governor Romney at the time in Massachusetts and Governor Pataki in New York. Then you had obviously Democratic governors in many other administrations. And it did take time to kind of work through it. The difference is that we didn't really have a federal framework that we were responding to in any kind of way. And so, the negotiations were very much kind of what could keep the family together. How many additional allowances does a certain state need to keep them happy? What is the apportionment going to look like? What are the, there's very much a kind of a back and forth negotiation that occurred because there wasn't a kind of a specific target that folks were trying to get to on the early side. It was kind of try to stay within roughly where 2005 emissions were. They're kind of getting down over time. Obviously, the projections for having a 10% decrease over the next 10 years were wildly underestimated how much additional actual reduction we would achieve, which was closer to 45% between fuel switching and efficiency and kind of changing market conditions. But so it was a fairly tortured process. I think what's different here is that you'll have an actual framework. And we have a lot of conversations among the commissioners across the states. We were just together at the Environmental Council of States last week. And folks are beginning to do the actual thinking for their state for how to think through this process. And I think the more folks get into, okay, well, what if I put together my own state plan, and I have to figure out how to account for efficiency, but I don't really have EM, and I don't really have evaluation, measurement, and verification down to a science, and a lot of our power is imported, so I'm not sure how to count that. Our renewables, we got a lot of renewables. We're buying credits from out of states. We're not sure how to account for that. Our fuel switching, well, that's great, but that's not really enforceable. So if the market condition changes, that could go back. So I don't know how to account for that. We got something on response, but really, that could be dispatched or not. So we don't know how to account for that. When you start looking at all these different pieces, from an environmental regulator point of view, who doesn't typically deal with these issues in most states, that's a pretty daunting set of calculus that you're trying to put together. And I take the point of the last panel, like you can't be worried about all of that to such a level of granularity that's paralysis, but you still need an enforceable plan. Now you compare that to having a state budget, where if you have a cap with some kind of allowance that then is a fungible, tradable commodity, you don't have to worry about all that. And all of a sudden, you don't have to account for all those things because everything is wrapped up into your cap. And I think that's the conversation that a lot of folks are coming to, even folks whose governors would disown them if they knew they were having any kind of conversation around the vile cap and trade, even though it was originally their idea. They're all coming to the same conclusion, that some kind of mass-based approach makes more sense because the accounting is so much easier. And that's where the regional conversations become easier, because all of a sudden you're saying, well, we're all talking about the same thing, so let's make sure, as Paul and I were talking about earlier today, let's make sure it's a fungible program. Let's make sure that they can link. Let's make sure that the programs can fit together. And that's the conclusion you're seeing over and over and over again, these state commissioners coming to.
Anybody else want to?
We face those same issues on a state-by-state basis, informing the RTOs, the regional transmission organizations that manage our marketplace. And in so doing, we turned over control of generation plants to the ISO dispatch process. And all load-serving responsibilities were also turned over to the RTOs. So if the states can come together around those issues and form these RTOs, to us it doesn't seem like much of a stretch to add carbon management to that plate of market opportunities. And I think the reason that states were able to come together on formation of the RTOs is that there was enough savings to go around. In other words, there's a lot of benefit to working across state lines in our industry and allowing flows of economic signals and production and consumption across state lines. And we think we'll see the same thing with carbon management, that RTOs are already managing for reliability and affordability of electricity supply. To add carbon management as a third tenet to that, to us, does not seem like a big stretch, and it would leverage some of the infrastructure that we've created and worked hard to develop over the last decades.
Yeah, I mean, let me add to that in terms of RTOs. RTOs are purely voluntary organizations. Transmission owners can come and go. And indeed, they have at various points in time. But the reason that we've seen the growth in RTOs, whether it's MISO or PJM or now SPP in the Great Plains states, is that these transmission owners and generation owners see a benefit to being a part of a wider regional organization that minimizes the cost of unit commitment, dispatch, resource adequacy, planning, and so forth. It's no different if we're thinking about this in terms of regional compliance with the states, where they can choose to opt into regional compliance and then come together and say, look, this is a lower cost option for us potentially. Let's explore this and move forward. I think one of the things, though, in terms of thinking about the state implementation plans, and I don't know if EPA can do this, by the way, but it's a thought that at least I've had on this, is that, the state implementation plans, the timeline is very short. They're going to have about a 13-month time frame to get the original SIPs in place. Now, one option here is that if one does the math and work backwards, that really compliance at a minimum is not going to start until 2018. So if we have state implementation plans that come in 2016, and states in an RTO region decide that they want to opt into regional compliance, it's not necessary that they have all of the details worked out. To Colin's point here, it took RGGI states 3.5 years to work this out. It took the old OTAG and Ozone Transport Commission groups several years to get a NOx budget program in place as well. And so at least having that flexibility in what would be an acceptable SIP initially, 13 months after the finalization of the rule, and then going into the 2018 compliance state, where then the states can then work out all of those details, I think is going to be something that's helpful. It's something that certainly when we have new transmission owners integrating into PJM, they don't just decide one day I'm going to integrate and it happens. It's a long, arduous, detailed process that takes usually well over a year, sometimes 2 years to happen. We should probably expect the same kind of thing in this case.
Is there any argument against, any good economic or environmental argument you could make against multi-state cooperation? Pretend you're not from the states that you are, don't have the hats you have on. How would you make the argument that this is a lame idea?
Well, I
It's an
certainly,
audience question.
I have an answer to that. I'm not sure I want to be the one that's arguing for the lack of regional cooperation, but certainly there are concerns that are raised. When you raise the idea of working across state lines, collaborating with other utilities and other states, other jurisdictions on carbon management, there are concerns that are raised, and one of those concerns is cost shifts. And I think the answer to that concern is that cost shifts in any regulation of carbon dioxide are inevitable. We are going to see cost shifts as CO2 is regulated. We're going to see, on a percentage basis, a greater impact on coal-fired utilities than those that are more reliant on nuclear, natural gas, or wind. And so we're going to see those impacts. Now, how do we manage those costs? If there are savings and benefits to working across state lines on a regional basis, those will flow to everyone in the region. And there are ways to design the market in such a way that everyone wins from collaborating. But certainly going into it, folks will be worried about what are the impacts on my utility, my cost, my state, or the people in my state. And there are valid concerns, and those are things that can get worked out in a discussion among stakeholders within that state. The other thing I'd like to point out is we really are facing right now on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions in this country, a very murky situation for utilities. It creates inaction. Nobody really knows what to invest in other than natural gas power plants and renewables. You're not sure how long to hang on to coal plants or how much to invest in coal plants. There's just so much complexity, inaction, and uncertainty that is leading to very real concerns about reliability in the power grid. And by converting all these issues into a regional framework that has a price for carbon that folks can plan around, you eliminate some of that murkiness and you return it to a situation where you're making decisions based on economics. You make an investment decision in your power plant with some expectation of what kind of return you will get from that investment. And that's one of the benefits of getting organized in a marketplace on greenhouse gas regulation.
Anybody else want to take up the question of what some of the costs might be associated with regional coordination?
I mean, let me approach this from a slightly more theoretical point of view. I mean, there's a whole reason that we have regional cooperation in RTO. It's lower cost for everybody. There are gains from trade to be made. And so to the extent that somebody wants to go it alone, chances are they're leaving money on the table, whether it's a state that thinks that they have no problem meeting compliance and in fact are over-complying, whereas if there are a mechanism that shall not be named, you've said it, I won't say it, I call it Voldemort, they're leaving money on the table. By the same token, a state that is going to have a hard time meeting its own state goal, that doesn't want to cooperate across state lines and benefit from that, they're going to raise costs to their own customers to try to comply. And again, they're leaving money on the table. So at the end of the day, I don't see why regional compliance doesn't make sense from that point of view, especially with all the empirical evidence we've got from the way RTO markets work, from the way previous cap and trade programs have worked on that. It just kind of boggles the mind how that would work, how that could be justified.
Is there an optimal number of regions? Thanks, Mike.
No, I mean, I think the economies of scale get bigger. Obviously, the bigger the region is, and I think that we've hopefully proven out in the current RGGI market that the economies of scale actually are improved as the market expands over time.
Let's do a little lightning round for Secretary O'Mara. How does RGGI account for energy efficiency? Are there lessons there for others in this? And does a mass-based program like RGGI negate the need for project-level measurement of energy efficiency reductions?
Yeah, so the way the RGGI budget works, you actually set an emission limit, and it's calculated for, and every unit that's more than 25 megawatts has to have individual allowances for every ton of carbon dioxide they produce. So, a natural gas plant's going to need half an allowance for every megawatt hour. A coal plant's going to need 1.8 or I guess 0.9 allowances for every megawatt hour they produce. Because you have a cap at that level, the efficiency is rolled into there. And so, so if you create energy efficiency somewhere else, someone's going to have to generate somewhere else a little less in the system, so therefore it's accounted for. So the cap that you have across the entire region, so right now 91 million tons, is actually accounts for all the other good stuff kind of going on that kind of keep you at that cap. So one of the things we've seen in our region is about 15% of our demand over the past few years has been met through energy efficiency to kind of reduce the amount of additional generation coming online. The one thing that's different about RGGI compared to a lot of other programs, particularly some of the European programs, is that almost every dollar that is generated through the auctions for the allowances is reinvested back into the clean energy economy, primarily in efficiency, about 65%, a little in renewables, and some other smaller projects. But because you have that investment, you're driving massive investment into the regions. You don't have a lot of the losses that some other places have seen if they just put that money into the general operating expense or just right back to ratepayers through a kind of a direct subsidy. You get this multiplier benefit, and we can show that we're getting almost $2 to $3 worth of value for every dollar that we're spending on efficiency, as many of you know. There are a couple states that have rated the RGGI accounts to balance budgets in the past. One we're hoping to encourage to come back into the region very soon. But the folks that have had it, because you get the secondary benefit of you get jobs from efficiency, you get lower prices. You see both capacity prices coming down a little bit because you're actually reducing overall load. You see individual usage go down as well, and so the secondary benefits come through. But that all allows you to have a lower and lower cap, as opposed to being a way to kind of have allowances dedicated to efficiency as part of the cap.
This is for John and Paul. How would the Great River Energy tax proposal work if only some states in RTO or ISO participated?
So let me just talk a little bit about the Great River Energy proposal. I wouldn't call it a tax proposal. It's a proposal to set a price for carbon dioxide. So you translate this equivalency goal into a regional target for CO2 emissions. So let's say it's for MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. You have a total CO2 emissions amount. We would argue it'd be a rate-based amount. It'd be a tons per megawatt hour that would govern the entire region. You also could do it mass-based, but it would be for the whole region. You'd set it once, and it'd be based upon negotiation between the 15 states involved in the ISO and the EPA to determine what is the equivalency level. You take that cap. From that, you derive what carbon price is necessary to charge generation in that region on a per-ton basis as a variable cost that gets you to that cap. And the presence of a carbon price will change the dispatch mix on a daily basis for generation selection. So you'll choose some more natural gas, a little less coal on a daily basis to achieve your target. The carbon price is what gets you to that result. You're actually collecting these carbon revenues on a per-ton basis from the generators. This is not a social cost of carbon calculation. This is what price is needed to clear the market in such a way that you're achieving the cap. So it's not a social cost of carbon. It's an economic signal. The revenues are collected by the ISO. Those dollars are returned to load-serving entities on a per megawatt hour basis. And this offsets a share of the cost of this regulation. It doesn't offset at all. So the net energy efficiency signal actually goes up under the plan. And you're returning all those carbon revenues back to load-serving entities for rate mitigation. And the benefits of this is that you get comparative advantage, you allow for things to flow across state lines, and not everybody has to do the same thing. You can make a decision within your utility about how you want to position yourself in this marketplace. The plan does work if, let's say, of the 15 states, you've got 1 or 2 that don't want to participate in it. We have designed a couple of mechanisms to deal with that. Ideally, you'd have everybody involved, or at least almost everyone involved in the solution. The more that you get, the better off you'll be on an economic savings basis. And we look forward to engaging in the discussion. And this is one way to get there, is with a carbon price, with those revenues flowing back to load-serving entities for rate relief. And so that's why we don't call it a tax. It's not flowing to the government. It's not flowing to a carve-out program. It's only going back to load-serving entities per megawatt hour. And so that's one way. Another way is cap and trade, such as the RGGI approach, or there are other ideas as well. And we look forward to regional discussions.
Paul, comments on that?
I mean, from the perspective of what happens if, let's say in PJM, that you have a group of states that wants to do regional compliance, and then you have another subset of states that decides that they want to go it alone. Does that make things more difficult? The answer is not really, because if you assume that states that go it alone, by definition, they're going to have to meet whatever their target is. Whatever is mandated in the standard, they're going to have to meet that by definition. So what you're then left with on a regional basis are the remaining states that opt into regional compliance, and then will effectively have regional compliance among themselves as a subset of the states in the RTO. Now, it is going to have, if you have states that do go it alone, it is going to have an effect on dispatch. It may have an effect on the location of new capacity or retirements of existing capacity. Those are not going to be avoided, but in terms of actually implementing regional compliance, if you have some states, a subset of states opt out, that's fine. The remaining states that opt in are effectively opting in amongst themselves at that stage. And so, it's actually fairly straightforward from an administrative standpoint, because you then assume that the states that go it alone must meet their standard. I mean, almost by definition in their state implementation plan.
Someone from the audience wants to know, what can FERC do to facilitate multi-state compliance programs? What is the role of FERC in all of this?
Well, I would say that there's a role in enabling the economic signals to be handled by the utilities that are regulated by FERC. The ISOs themselves are creatures of FERC, and so there may be tariff changes that are necessary depending on what approach a region wants to take. We think FERC will see the benefit of working with regions, because this is all voluntary. EPA cannot require regional collaboration, regional solutions. It's not within their purview to require it. They can only enable it. So if a region comes forward with a solution, it's because the region wants that solution, that they see the benefits of that solution. And if they see the benefits of it, certainly FERC will be a part of that team effort to put whatever measures are needed in place to enable a market-based regional solution to emerge and actually stand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's maybe 2 things. One is just making sure there aren't any kind of undue kind of barriers that are put up. But the second thing is, I think that kind of the resolution of Order 1000 leaves a lot to be desired. And so when you're looking at kind of bigger, kind of renewable projects and multi-state projects and things like that, I mean, the fact that there wasn't more guidance coming out, the more that is decided at the local, at the ISO level, I think creates some potential inequities among regions. So I think there's those kind of questions, but for the most part, just kind of stay out of the way, because I think that the states and the ISOs can actually figure out most of the pieces on their own.
Well, I think FERC's role has already largely been played. I think if you think about it from a planning perspective, and one of the things that we haven't talked about on this panel but has been mentioned before is reliability. And we have proposed as a group of RTOs a reliability safety valve. And that is, to the extent that there are generating units that, because of the rule that's proposed by the states or regional compliance, decide that they want to retire, and that retirement leads to a reliability problem, that there should be some sort of safety valve to allow those resources to stay in service until the appropriate reliability solutions can be put in place. Generally, it'll be a transmission build-out, like we saw with the mercury and air toxic standards. And so, but the reliability, so in that sense, the reliability piece is similar to MATS, but it's also an ongoing one, because unlike MATS, which has a drop-dead date of April 16th, 2015, this is going to be ongoing. So generators may decide initially to go forward, realize that they can't economically make it given the rules, and then decide to retire. So this is going to be something that's ongoing, But this is already baked into the RTO tariffs in their reliability analyses when units submit their deactivation notices. So FERC has already set these up in the tariffs, so to speak. FERC has already approved in the tariffs the ability to allow certain environmental costs, by definition, that are included in the tariff. So FERC has already had a say in that respect. So to that extent, you know, I think FERC's already played that role. And to Colin's point on Order 1000, I think the one thing that Order 1000 provides the RTOs, and PJM had already kind of taken a little bit of a lead on this prior to the issuance of Order 1000, or the final rule in our compliance filing, is that we can actually take a look and run scenarios. If we think that there are, because of environmental policies or renewable energy policies, a subset of generation that may be at risk for retirement, we will in our planning processes run scenarios. I believe MISO does something similar to that as well, where we'll run scenarios, we'll take a look, and if it looks like there's a preponderance of evidence that there may be a lot of units retiring, then we can actually get transmission solutions into our transmission expansion planning process proactively looking at this. And that's one of the things about the safety valve that we've proposed, is that once we can see the state implementation plans, then we as RTOs can then take a look at the state implementation plans in aggregate, do those kinds of analyses to see where the reliability problems may rest, to try to take care of those, and possibly, even if there's a particularly problematic state implementation plan that seems to be causing the majority of the reliability problems, to make sure that we inform EPA of that. And then EPA, it's up to them. I don't know if they have the authority to do so, but if they do, the authority to actually send the SIP back on reliability grounds to say that, you know, something needs to be different so that we can move this forward in a reliable fashion.
I mean, it seems to me that the multi-state, one of the advantages is the reliability, that you can press that harder when you're interconnected in a way that you might be able to pull more resources in to deal with these reliability issues. Does anyone else want to comment about reliability? It was such a big part of each discussion today, building on what Paul said. Or
I'd actually like to add a couple of things. I mean, there were some comments made earlier. You know, we're moving toward a more gas-centric or gas-heavy generation mix, and you know, in large part, it's because of environmental rules, it's because of the shale gas plays, it's because of the economies of scale now in new gas-fired technologies. You can build bigger combined cycles for about the same price. The heat rate improvements have been tremendous over the last decade. So there's a whole variety of factors moving us in that direction. But I think it's really important to understand that the winter weather in January in PJM, Commissioner Hake mentioned this in his comments, the 40,000 megawatts forced out on our coal during the polar vortex on January 7th. Of those megawatts that were forced out, less than a quarter were because of gas curtailments. It was actually performance of other resources. In fact, there were nearly 14,000 megawatts of coal-fired resources that were forced out for entirely different reasons besides gas availability on January 7th. And so I think we have to be careful that, you know, in talking about, you know, coal versus gas and all the reliability issues, that we step back and take a look at all of the data and all the information. And I think that a large chunk of those resources were resources that had already decided to retire due to the mercury and air toxic standards. And if those decisions had been made, there's just not a whole lot of room to be doing a whole lot of operation and maintenance expense to keep a unit alive one more year at that point if you're going to retire it anyway. So I think it's just important to understand that, you know, the issues with gas, it is a problem. We need to work on gas-electric coordination. You know, not only the timing of our markets, with the recent FERC NOPRs about, you know, the movement of the gas day and the movement of timely nominations, the movement of the electric markets, market closing, and also some of the issues with the timing of the commodity gas market, where it's very difficult to get gas on weekends, where some people have even intimated, I think I've probably even said it myself, that some of these gas traders work bankers hours. They come in, they're done by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then you can't get them on the weekend, otherwise it's market by Rolodex. Now, I know that's not a fair statement. I know that there are a lot of marketers that are out there, but that's a conception that, you know, is often plays out, and you've heard it at the FERC technical conferences. We've heard it from our own generators. So, you know, there are other reliability issues on top of this whole rule related to gas-electric coordination that you know, we also need to factor in here.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are some interesting policy questions as we see more of the transmission projects, you know, kind of be pushed out further and further because of demand concerns or other kind of changes in the forecast, and folks are trying to get pipelines through in real ways. And it's not a supply issue necessarily; it's more of a distribution issue. But there's a lot of projects that I think could be parts of plans that may or may not actually be able to meet kind of the hurdle rates and kind of the traditional way that we finance gas infrastructure compared to the way we finance transmission infrastructure. So some very interesting questions there. One thing I would encourage, I see a lot of friendly faces here. I would encourage you to actually start talking to the state regulators fairly soon if you're not already directly at the commissioner level. Let them know what you're hearing. Let them, if you believe in these ideas of more market creation, less prescriptive, more flexible approaches. Making that communication in a regular way is going to be important. A lot of commissioners and air directors and others are fairly inclined to have more prescriptive, kind of more risk-averse approaches. And so those of us on the East Coast have been part of these big trading programs for a while, maybe not as much in some other parts of the country, but they are the ultimate authors of the plans, right? They have to get their governors to sign off. They're the ones that have to implement them. And I do feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect that not enough folks are talking to them. And actually, on July 31st, the whole mess of them are going to be here in D.C. ECOS is going to put together a conference where we're going to be looking at many of these issues as states are looking at the first guidance and then beginning to pull together their plans. But please, I think there's great conversations going on in a whole bunch of different places, but make sure you're talking to the folks actually going to be authoring the plans as a lot of these other conversations are going place, because I'm not sure they're always as central as they probably should be.
With respect to reliability, we can't just assume it. And we've got to think about how to preserve it. And it's going to be cheaper if we do that now rather than 5 or 10 years from now, after we've shut down a lot of coal plants. With our plan and with other market plans, part of the solution is you take some of the coal and you have it run less. So there's a dispatch solution that's a part of the equation here. Well, when you do that, you take away the incentive for that utility who has a coal plant that's sidelined some of the year to keep the plant around. And you're going to continue to see some plants get shut down under any carbon regulation. So as these EPA rules come forward, there also needs to be a tandem set of reliability constructs that regions develop to make sure that plants that are part of the solution by running less, they've still got the economic signal to stay in operation and to be there to provide the reliability need. So they're providing a benefit to the market by emitting less CO2. But how are they getting compensated to do that? And a reliability construct is an important way to do that. And EPA can talk about preserving reliability in its rules, and I'm sure that that's one of their aims. But we've got to, as an industry, as RTOs, as collections of state regulators, think about, do we have the right constructs in place to ensure that reliability? And I think the more we do right now to put those rules in place to encourage the preservation of capacity on the system, the cheaper it's going to be. And if we wait too long, the costs are going to go up. Because then you're talking about bringing new resources online and getting firm natural gas to those resources in every case, and pipeline expansion and the whole works. So cheaper to do it now, and let's have a tandem set of reliability constructs come forward as these EPA rules get developed.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, I think this is going back to the question about what role does FERC play. I think FERC plays a huge role here, indirectly in the greenhouse gas regulation through the gas electric coordination issue. I think that's coming through loud.
The other thing that we see is, traditionally over the last 10 years or so, folks have said that the reliability signal is basically the energy market, that as the energy prices go up, you'll naturally have incentive to keep power plants around. Well, that short-term energy price is not the signal that's needed to keep a 50-year investment in place. You can't make those decisions based upon a monthly or a daily energy market. So there's got to be a longer-term view on reliability.
Shifting gears just a little bit, looking kind of at the whole issue of maybe multi-policy coordination. One of the reasons we're where we are today and are looking at a 111D that might be less costly overall than it might have been 10 years ago, this came up in a previous panel. We have a lot of different policies at the state level and the federal level that are really helping drive more energy efficiency, more renewables into the system. And I wonder as we go forward with 111D whether there's going to be a continual push to deepen those kinds of policies, or can a 111D framework kind of replace some of that machinery? And I think this goes under sort of the bigger topic of do we have energy policies and energy signals that are moving in the right direction towards a lower carbon future, and do we have some redundancies built in there that may be unnecessary once 111D is up and running in 5-10 years where it's really maybe a deeper program. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Well, I would say that the states are very active on this issue already. And so to a certain extent, the federal government is stepping in now with the 111D regulation to regulate something that's already happening. States are already moving us into renewable energy and energy efficiency and making decisions in integrated resource plans about the future of coal production in their state. And it's happening all over the country. There is no new investment going on in coal other than in CHP. So, now you're wading into a situation that's already, in the works. States have shown some progress on this, and moving that forward to a collaborated regional market basis, we think could help the economics of that.
I mean, I do think that the framework is a way to kind of tie together a lot of those existing programs, whether efficiency standards, renewable programs, RPS and the like. I think the one difference is that you could see a whole lot of investment in efficiency, a whole lot of investment in switching to natural gas. I think there are some renewables on kind of the higher end of the cost curve that could kind of not see a lot of activity. The NRDC analysis, some of it showed maybe not seeing a lot of growth in solar, for example, under a strict 111 framework. And so if states are interested in kind of preserving diversity of technologies, I think there's probably a role for that. But I think more and more states are going to be thinking about how these policies fit into their state budget, if that's where they end up, or the regional budget, and kind of having everything go through this 111 lens rather than a bunch of standalone policies like they are now.
Yeah, I think it actually depends on how each state implements 111D. Honestly, I think if you go down the road where states actually want to engage in the mechanism that shall not be named, then effectively it may render a renewable portfolio standard or the price of RECs essentially, moot. It might actually drive it to zero potentially. On the other hand, if a state goes down a different road, then there still may be a role in their state implementation plan for renewable portfolio standards or energy efficiency in some way, shape, or form, certainly. So I think it's going to really depend on how that's actually implemented. But to Colin's point, if you're going down the road of a cap and trade program, then effectively this all kind of ties everything together in a nice way.
Colin, I have a couple of RGGI-related questions. One about, has RGGI been a drag on the economy? These are kind of general economic questions, maybe looking at how has it affected participating states, job rates, electricity rates, and have any of the revenues from RGGI been used to fund worker transition programs? So maybe just talking about the economic impacts of RGGI. Have they been negative? Can you measure them in any way outside of their obvious cleaner air aspects?
There's a great study that I encourage folks to take a look at that Sue Tierney at the analysis group put together about a year ago that really looked at the economics of RGGI over the first few years. And the net benefit across the RGGI region was about $1.8 billion of economic benefit because of this investment in efficiency. If it was just a cap and trade program where the revenues would have gone into the general coffers and gone towards education or prisons or Medicaid or something, you wouldn't have seen that overall net benefit. But we can show that bills are down. If you look at per capita usage in our region, it's down compared to a lot of places despite more inclement weather. And so there's a tangible linkage between the use of the allowances and then the overall benefit in the economy. There's tens of thousands of jobs that have been created in the efficiency space and the renewable space directly linked to some of these investments. And so there hasn't been the catastrophic kind of mentality inside or kind of theoretical push that you hear in the Beltway a lot about cap and trade being the death of the economy. For a program that's actually implemented a cap and trade program and continues to tighten it over time, the results are the exact opposite. So it's just kind of don't believe the rhetoric. Look at the actual results. In terms of transition and things like that, we're actually seeing a lot of investment in new combined cycle plants, a lot of CHP and a lot of renewables going in our states. Our growth across the region is as strong, if not stronger, than most other parts of the country in terms of job growth. So there hasn't been the drag that one governor in particular suggested that there was from the program.
Okay, go do your reading. Can the panelists discuss, I think they can, how supply-side cost recovery needs are integrated with demand-side cost recovery by ratepayers or power companies? This kept coming up in previous discussions of kind of how big is the fence, who's in the fence, who's out of the fence, and how do you take into consideration the non-power generation side of all of this within a multi-state framework?
I'm not sure what the question means in terms of demand side cost recovery. I think from an RTO market perspective, the cost of environmental compliance, whether it's in the form of a cap and trade program like the SO2 trading program or CARE or the NOx budget program, I mean, those can be reflected in the energy market automatically. The cost of reg allowances are reflected in our energy market for the resources in Maryland and Delaware. To the extent that there are investments that are made for compliance. So, for example, we heard the panel before lunch this morning talking about compliance options briefly within the fence line, heat rate improvements, things of that nature. Those would be investment costs that could be reflected in our reliability pricing model capacity market, which goes to an issue that John brought up, that I think it's right that you can't just depend on an energy-only market, which is why we have a capacity construct that is 3 years forward, so we do get those investment signals. I think what we've seen with that is that, given the MATS rule, where we saw a lot of units making decisions to go or not go or to reflect those costs and see if they could actually move forward. And then we were able to get resources to replace them. And so I think, we've already got a good setup, at least within PJM, for that. And so to that extent, I don't think there's really anything else that needs to be done. How that gets translated down to the retail levels, up to the retail regulators, that's really not in our bailiwick.
Others want to jump on that? Here's one. How does the invalidation of the Clean Air Interstate Rule portend judicial resistance to multi-state requirements under 111D? Anybody put their lawyer hat on?
Well, I wouldn't put the lawyer hat on about this one, but I would say that a regional approach is something that is going to be voluntary. It's something that is state-driven. So state discussion and collaboration leads to the development of a regional approach. And in that sense, it's not something that is mandated or required. So it really is outside the purview of that type of judicial review, other than you may have a participant or two within that framework, within that multi-state agreement that doesn't want to be a part of it. So you could see a challenge from that. But as far as the EPA is concerned, they can't mandate a regional solution. They can only enable a regional solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think the judicial, when Kavanaugh struck down the Casper rule, I mean, he basically had two main points. One was that it called for a federal solution as opposed to allowing the states to fix it themselves first. And the second was that there's a price cap that he argued could have states doing more than their fair share, more than their fair contribution. In this case, it is a state-based approach, so you won't have that test. The second one is that you will have to fill your contribution, and as of right now, no one's talked about kind of a cost test being part of it. So one of those issues. You'll have a fence line question, you'll have some other questions, but it won't be the same. It won't be the same legal questions that Kavanaugh raised in the Casper decision, which we're hoping the Supreme Court will fix before sending it back.
Someone from the audience wants to know who will be the drivers of interstate or cross-state coordination. Will it be the ISOs, the RTOs, or will it be the state regulators? I think you hinted on a little bit of this earlier, but there's probably no one clear way if this is going to get done. It will probably depend quite a bit on the regions. How are you all looking at this from who's going to be in charge?
Well, based on the discussions we've had, I would expect that the ISOs need to have a role in terms of convening the discussion, providing the data and the information and the infrastructure necessary to really have a productive discussion in the region. But who's going to drive it? It's really going to be people from the states, and whether those be regulatory commissioners, air quality regulators, and utilities from states. That's really what's got to drive it. It's going to have to be a collaborative discussion of those people, those individuals, to make this happen. But it can be convened and enabled by the RTO.
Yeah, I think John's absolutely right that at the end of the day, it's going to be agreements among state commissioners and governors to get this done. However, the best chance to take the politics out of this conversation and again being able to talk about some of these market-based mechanisms on a regional basis is for the ISOs to send RTOs to send an early signal that they either encourage or they're willing to help facilitate it, and then having the utilities say we'd rather have that kind of common platform than 50 different regulatory environments. Particularly for like an AEP that's in 14 different states, or NRG or Calpine, or all these guys that are operating so many different jurisdictions. The regulatory nightmare that could occur if everyone went their own way. Sending that signal, saying, look, we think it's going to be cheaper, we think it's going to be more predictable, more efficient, because we have a regional approach that's market-based. Sending that signal to a governor's office or to an environmental commissioner can help diffuse the politics in a way that we haven't been able to inside the Beltway so far.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to play a little wordsmithing here. I mean, in terms of the RTOs convening this, I'm not sure that that is appropriate in the sense that the RTOs are trying to drive the states to cooperate. We're simply opening the door for it. I think it's really important that the states lead this. And then, I think as part of that, then the RTOs play a huge role in terms of being that technical resource in terms of understanding how these mechanisms work within the RTO context, what the potential outcomes of different policy options are, things of that nature. But I think, it seems like a distinction without meaning to many, but I think it's really important that the states are really driving this and that we could be the facilitator insofar as, providing meeting logistics and things like that. But I think, in terms of taking the leadership role in trying to be viewed as forcing something, I think is just not our role there.
Well, it kind of goes back to a question I had earlier about how's this all going to play out in the next really the next year. We're going to see a draft rule come out sometime in June. We get a year, or far less than that, really, to chew on that and provide comments. What do you think is the best thing that could happen within that in that year in terms of getting states, getting localities to kind of look at what the implications might be and to weigh in on what they like and what they don't like, and then as well to set themselves up ready for a final rule and all the work that has to come then? It just seems there's a lot of moving pieces here, and what might be a way in which we could think about how states are going to respond, how regions are going to respond within the very time frame that they have. Is there any guidance that you might give other than opening a door? Is there any kind of a push that you'd like to see either from EPA or from others to help these conversations along? Shameless plug. We could certainly be helpful there too.
Yeah, I think the idea of having an independent convening entity bring together officials and stakeholders from the states within an ISO region would be really helpful and could lead to some fruitful discussions.
Yeah, I do think that the day the rule comes out, you're going to see states doing two things on parallel tracks. One is beginning to think about what their plan would look like, assuming the draft is very close to the final, which it likely will be. Assuming how if past evidence is any indicator, and then the second is seeing what little tweaks they might want on the margins. But we've been having conversations at the environmental commissioner level for 2 years, about this and what the rule will look like, and even a little before the president's speech, kind of beginning to lay the groundwork. When I was chair of RGGI, we were already talking to other states. Since almost the endangerment finding came out, because this was ultimately going to come down, whether it's by administrative action or by the courts. But I do think that the more that we can encourage those conversations to occur as early as possible, so you're not just looking at a 1-year or 11-month, plan development process, really looking at a 2-year development process, that gives yourselves the best chance to any kind of regional collaboration in the early submittals in 2016.
Yeah, I think even beyond that, though, I mean, there's one thing to have a large group, an independent party, bring states together, and the public service commissions, state energy offices, the environmental regulators all together. But I mean, one of the things that we've been doing, ourselves from a PJM perspective, is actually going out to the state commissions, to the environmental regulators, building those relationships, and kind of explaining, why we're looking at regional compliance, and then basically serving as a resource, answering questions they may have. Well, what happens if it's X? How might that work? What happens if it's Y? How might that work? And I think it kind of lays the groundwork for thinking about what happens when the proposed rule comes out, and so that everybody's already starting to think what those SIPs might look like before the rule even comes out. So to the point that Colin's talking about, that's one, that's on one end, but from our perspective, we're also doing that kind of outreach, not only just with the states, but also with our member companies, because I mean, we've got member companies that are going to run across the gamut of what they could live with and what they can't live with, and understanding their interests and where they're at on these issues as well.
Thank you. We're about running out of time. I want to give our panelists an opportunity for a few last words of encouragement or caution. I do want to say that we have 200 people watching on the web, so if they've tweeted in a question, somebody raise their hand over at that table and we can get one last one in. John, you want to go ahead?
Sure. When we think about the coal fleet in the United States, this is the country that can lead the world on innovation and development of new technologies. And when we think about the greenhouse gas problem that the world faces, let's bring U.S. technologies to bear on reducing those CO2 emissions globally. We've got one very small example of that at our company. We have a technology called dry fining, and it was developed by our engineers with support from Department of Energy. And we take waste heat from the power plant process and we dry the coal, the lignite coal, before we burn it in the boiler. We take the moisture content from 37% down to 31%, and it results in a more efficient burn. We have less water vapor in the flue gas, the exhaust gas. We get 4% less CO2 emissions with the same output of electricity from the power plant. We've been marketing this technology, and we haven't found a buyer in the United States yet. Nobody in the United States wants to invest in coal right now. Where did we find a buyer? It was in China. We've exported this technology to China. They're going to be using this at up to 16 lignite-fired coal plants in China, and we're helping to reduce the global CO2 emissions with a U.S. technology. It's developed in North Dakota at our power plant. And you know, it's a small contribution, but our company's proud of it, and it's an example of what the United States can do in terms of innovating. If we keep our coal fleet and figure out how to make it cleaner, more efficient, eventually solve carbon capture and sequestration, those are technologies that can benefit the world, and then you really start to have a global impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And if you simply just turn away from coal in this country and shut down every coal plant in this country, we won't contribute to global solutions. We won't be part of that technology development. So I guess that would be my final message is let's innovate. Let's be a part of the solution. Let's work through our existing coal fleet to drive these new technologies and bring them to bear for the world.
This is complicated stuff, and trying to bring together states is obviously a complicated endeavor. But markets work, and I think we've proven that we have a plug-and-play system that other states could easily join. I still think this is one of the greatest market opportunities for innovation that this country's seen in a long time. If we have the right kind of economic structure that allows that kind of innovation to take place, we feel very strongly that the budget and invest system that we have, if I can coin a new phrase. So I don't get censored on C-SPAN or whoever's carrying this. A program like that really could be something that's easily replicable, that avoids a lot of the state programs. And so as you're talking to folks, if you have questions of me or others or states that are interested in this kind of approach, let us know. I've had conversations with probably 25 states that are interested in some form of participating in a program like this because they view it as a much cleaner, more elegant, more plug-and-play solution to their challenge, and much more cost-effective one. Much more cost-effective way to get the results that we all desire. And I do think having that kind of common platform, whether it's one system or multiple systems around the country, is the best form that we have to actually achieve the results that we want and the economic benefits that could come from it if we design it the right way.
I've got really three parting shots. The first one is on reliability. I think it's pretty clear that the RTOs already have the mechanisms in place to help ensure reliability and just trying to formalize this as a reliability safety valve. I think the second point is obviously regional compliance is probably going to be much more cost effective. Again, as we've talked about earlier, we get cost effective dispatch, resource adequacy planning, in RTO markets. There's no reason why regional compliance for environmental rules shouldn't have that. But there's a third piece that I want to leave you with, and that's something that we really haven't discussed here, and that is what happens at the seams between different RTOs and RTO and non-RTO areas, because I think this is really interesting. So for example, between PJM and MISO, we have 4 states that are on our seam. We've got Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky that are on our seam, that we both have members in each of those states. And the question comes up, well, how would regional compliance work in those states? Well, let's suppose that in a perfect world that all of the entities in PJM decided to go with PJM regional compliance, all of the entities in MISO decided to go with MISO regional compliance. Now you've got these states at the seams. What do? Well, if you're Illinois, for example, Illinois could say, gee, all of our resources that are in PJM, go to PJM compliance. All of our resources that are in MISO, go to MISO compliance. And then they could potentially write into the state implementation plan, oh, by the way, our resources within the state can actually exchange, average across emissions or trade, dare I say, emissions across those entities, across the RTOs. All of a sudden, rather than the seam being a problem, it actually creates fungibility between different regional compliance programs. So rather than being a barrier per se, it almost becomes potentially an opportunity in looking at that. So that's what I'll leave you with.
On that upbeat note, I'd first like to thank NARUC, our partners in this, the fabulous team at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Jennifer Macedonia, thank you so much. and everyone who helped her put this together. As our president said earlier in the day, watch this space. We're putting some modeling out from the Bipartisan Policy Center. We'll probably have additional meetings to, as he said, go in deeper on a number of these more technical issues. We hope you will join us, watch us on the web. And I want to thank our fabulous panel and all the panelists and the moderators today for a really great job. Very informative. Thank you very much.